The night was heavy, humid, and silent until it wasn't. Liberty Township, Ohio, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen, suddenly lit up with chaos. Sirens tore through the stillness, neighbors peeking out from their windows, hearts pounding at the sight of flashing red and blue. In the middle of Spruce Creek Road, under the dim yellow glow of the street lamps, a young woman lay sprawled across the pavement. Her hand still reached toward the door of her car, as if clinging to a final chance at escape. Spent shell casings glittered beside her like cruel ornaments, marking the place where her life ended. Within minutes, word spread. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was brutal. And it shattered a community that thought itself safe. But who was she? And why had she been lured into a trap she would never walk away from? In the early hours of the 9th of June 2020, police were called to a scene they could hardly believe belonged to quiet Liberty Township. A jogger, out earlier than usual, had stumbled upon a body lying in the street. His voice cracked as he dialed 911, struggling to form the words. "There's someone on the ground. I think she's dead." When officers arrived, they found a young woman, her long hair brushed across her face, her body cold to the touch. The street around her was eerily calm. No shouting, no struggle left to hear, only the faint clatter of empty shell casings that spoke of the violence minutes before. The identification in her pocket carried the name Collis Milton, but those who truly knew her called her Raya. She was 25 years old, a black transgender woman whose life was a mosaic of love, resilience, and quiet determination. In that moment, though, she was reduced to an evidence tag on a crime scene report. Even in death, her identity was questioned, her truth erased on the first page of official paperwork. To understand what brought her to this lonely stretch of road, you have to rewind to who Rhea was before the violence. Because behind that silent body was a life that burned brightly and dreams that had only begun to take shape. Born in 1,995 inches, Cincinnati, Ohio, Rhea grew up in a modest family. She wasn't born into privilege or abundance, but she was born with a spirit that carried light into every room she entered. Friends described her as someone who seemed to have a smile ready at all times, a smile that wasn't just polite, but contagious, spreading warmth to everyone who caught it. At family gatherings, she was the glue, playing with nieces and nephews, snapping photos, and making everyone laugh. To her siblings, she was both a protector and a confidant, the kind of sister you could tell secrets to without fear. Her chosen profession said even more about who she was. Rhea worked as a home healthcare assistant, a job that wasn't glamorous and certainly not lucrative, but one she wore with pride. Day after day, she poured herself into caring for patients who needed tenderness and attention, people who might have otherwise been forgotten. For Rhea, this wasn't just employment. It was a calling. She believed in compassion, in showing up for people who couldn't always fight for themselves. But Rhea's ambitions didn't stop there. Alongside her work, she was pursuing studies at the University of Cincinnati, aiming to step into public health. Her vision was bigger than herself. She wanted to contribute, to change lives on a larger scale. It's easy to think of dreams as abstract, but for Rhea, they were rooted in her daily actions. She lived them in small ways, every day, and planned to grow them into something lasting. On social media, she was open about her journey. In one post, not long before her death, she wrote, "Never afraid to fight. In the end, I will make it through. It was both a declaration and a shield against the world she knew wasn't always kind. Being a black transgender woman meant facing multiple forms of discrimination, racism, sexism, transphobia. Each one alone could crush a spirit. Together, they formed a storm that Rhea had to walk through every single day. Yet she walked it with grace, with courage, and with an insistence on living as her true self. But what Rhea couldn't control were the shadows that lingered in the corners of her world. Like so many modern connections, hers extended online, where relationships could be formed quickly and easily, often with strangers who seemed harmless at first glance. She was trusting, maybe too trusting, and that trust would prove to be the crack her killers exploited. On that June night, she thought she was simply meeting someone. A casual encounter, perhaps a quick drive, nothing more. But in reality, the people waiting for her had something else in mind. To them, she wasn't Rhea, the loving sister, the devoted caregiver, the ambitious student. To them, she was just a means to an end, a target, a car, a quick grab for cash. They weren't thinking of her humanity. They weren't thinking of her life. What unfolded next would transform a simple scheme into a nightmare. 3 figures waited in the shadows, each carrying a role in a plan that was as reckless as it was cruel. An 18-year-old boy with something to prove. A 14-year-old girl barely old enough to understand the weight of what she was about to do. And a man whose history of crime and violence had already left scars in the community. Together, they created a trap that Rhea never saw coming. She drove her sleek black Camaro down Spruce Creek Road, the clock nearing midnight, street lamps casting broken pools of light on the asphalt. She had no way of knowing she was driving straight into the last moments of her life. The figures emerged, voices raised, demands shouted. In seconds, the air filled with panic and resistance. Rhea fought back. She refused to surrender her keys, her car, her dignity. But defiance collided with a man's cold hand gripping a gun. The shots tore through the night, shattering not just the quiet of Liberty Township, but the futures of everyone connected to her. In less than 5 minutes, everything was over. Rhea's body lay still on the road, her killers speeding off into the darkness with nothing gained but the weight of a stolen life. And so the question lingers, haunting in its simplicity. How did a young woman who gave so much her love, her care, her determination, become the target of such cruelty? Was it random greed, or was there something more sinister at play, something rooted in the prejudice that had shadowed her life all along? There's more to the story than meets the eye: the hunt for the killers, the surprising involvement of a child, and the courtroom drama that follows. If you found Rhea's story compelling, be sure to subscribe, as the next installment will leave you wondering how such a tragedy could have unfolded in the heart of a normal community. Here, the focus will be on Rhea's personal life, her relationships, and how her everyday world intertwined with the people who would later play a role in her final night. We'll expand on her resilience, the vulnerabilities she faced, and the growing tension that pulled her unknowingly closer to danger. Rhea Milton didn't grow up imagining herself as a victim. She was the kind of person who lived with her head high, even when the world tried to bend her low. For those who loved her, she wasn't just another face in a crowd. She was the one who made people feel seen, who reminded them that kindness still existed in a world that often felt cold. In her mid-20s, Rhea was still carving her own path, but she had already achieved what many never could: authenticity. She lived openly as a transgender woman, and that was not a small victory. Every time she walked down a street, she faced the possibility of judgment, of whispers behind her back, of stares that lingered too long. But she kept walking, she kept smiling, and she kept dreaming. Her friends often said she had a gift for empathy, the kind of heart that could sit with your pain without trying to rush you out of it. Working in home healthcare wasn't just a paycheck, it was where that empathy lived and breathed. Patients described her as gentle, reliable, and attentive, and even when her shifts stretched long, when exhaustion pulled at her, she carried herself with a sense of dignity. But beneath that warmth was someone who carried battles silently. Being both black and transgender in America meant she lived at the intersection of multiple dangers. The numbers themselves were chilling. Violence against transgender women of color was rising year after year. And too many of those stories ended with silence. No justice. No answers. Rhea knew the risks. She felt them in the caution her friends expressed, in the warnings she sometimes brushed aside. Still, she refused to be reduced to a statistic. On social media, she showed glimpses of her boldness. She posted photos of herself with captions that hinted at resilience, at a determination to survive and thrive. One of her last posts read, "Never afraid to fight. In the end, I will make it through." Reading it now feels like a prophecy cut short, a voice that wanted to echo into the future, but was silenced too soon. At home, she was surrounded by a family who adored her. Her siblings leaned on her. Her nieces and nephews adored their Auntie Rhea, and her mother was proud of the woman her child had become. But like many young adults, she wanted more than love at home. She wanted connection, intimacy, companionship. And sometimes, she sought that connection in places where danger wore a mask of opportunity. In 2020, social media wasn't just a way to connect with friends. It was also a hunting ground for people with darker intentions. For women like Rhea, online interactions could be both a lifeline and a trap. A casual message, a promise of meeting up, could feel like the start of something good, or, tragically, the beginning of something fatal. The people who would later orchestrate her final night were not strangers to trouble. One was barely more than a boy himself, 18, young enough to still be figuring out adulthood but already carrying the weight of poor choices and reckless bravado. The other, a 14-year-old girl, should have been worried about school dances and homework. Instead, she found herself tethered to a scheme that would forever stain her life. Hovering over both was a man seasoned in crime, someone who understood how to manipulate, how to pull strings while letting others take the fall. For them, Rhea wasn't a person. She was a target, a car, a way to make a quick grab at something they didn't earn. Whether they chose her because of who she was, or simply because she happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, remains one of the most painful mysteries. Was it about greed, or was it about prejudice? Did they see her humanity at all, or only the shape of opportunity in front of them? The night she agreed to meet up, there was no warning sign, no flashing red light to tell her to turn around. She climbed into her Camaro, a car she was proud of, and drove down the familiar roads that cut through Liberty Township. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, the streetlights humming with faint yellow glow. In her phone, maybe there were messages guiding her to the spot. Maybe she felt a sense of excitement, curiosity, or simply the routine comfort of another ordinary evening. But this wasn't an ordinary evening. This was the night 3 lives hers, and those of the teenagers waiting in the shadows would collide in a way that could never be undone. In the hours before, did she glance in the mirror one last time, adjusting her hair the way she liked it, ready to step into the world as herself, proud and unshaken? Did she think about her mother, her family, her future? Or did she simply feel the quiet hum of another night, unaware that fate had already set its course? Because what awaited her on Spruce Creek Road wasn't just danger, it was betrayal. A staged encounter, a sudden demand, the cold barrel of a gun raised against her will to survive. In that moment, her kindness, her ambition, her resilience, all of it meant nothing to the people who confronted her. They didn't see Raya. They didn't care to. They only saw what they could take. And when she refused to surrender, when she stood her ground against the violence pressing in around her, that defiance sealed her fate. But here's the question that lingers like smoke after fire. What truly drove three people, one of them just a child, to lure a young woman into the night and end her life? Was it only about a car, or was it about the darker, uglier currents of hate that so often shadow women like Raya? The story is just beginning to unfold. In part 1, we'll follow a frantic investigation, the shocking arrest of a child, and the revelation of a conspiracy that will shock even seasoned detectives. If you're drawn to Ria's story, be sure to subscribe. The next chapter will reveal details that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the case. The night Ria Milton was killed, Spruce Creek Drive became more than a stretch of pavement. It became a crime scene, a riddle painted in blood and silence. Officers who arrived on the scene found a Camaro left abandoned, the door ajar, and Raya lying motionless, her body failing under the weight of wounds too brutal to recover from. Neighbors whispered about hearing a commotion, about seeing a figure or two darting into the shadows. But what stood out most was the silence that followed, an unsettling calm, as though the street itself was holding its breath. Investigators knew from the start that this wasn't random. The positioning of the car, the evidence scattered near her body, even the way her belongings had been handled, it spoke of calculation. Someone had lured her there. Someone had waited for her. As detectives combed the area, they found fragments of the truth in ordinary things. A discarded cell phone case, footprints pressed into the dirt, a cigarette butt still carrying the faint scent of smoke. Each detail became part of a puzzle that seemed to ask the same question: who wanted Ria Milton dead, and why? The first lead came from digital footprints. Ria's phone was missing, but her recent communications painted a trail investigators couldn't ignore. Texts and social media messages pointed to an arranged meeting that night, an encounter that ended in betrayal. Police turned to surveillance footage, canvassing gas stations, convenience stores, and traffic cameras along the roads Ria traveled. And then, a break. Images of her Camaro captured on nearby cameras, followed by blurry figures stepping into another vehicle after abandoning hers. It wasn't clear, but it was enough to narrow their search. The investigation picked up speed when whispers from the community began to surface. In tight-knit circles, secrets don't stay buried for long. Rumors of teenagers bragging, of a plan gone wrong, floated into the ears of detectives. Soon, names began to form, names that shocked even the most seasoned officers. The first suspect was barely 18, a young man already known to police for reckless behavior, drifting between bad decisions and dangerous company. His name was attached to Raya's final hours through messages recovered from her phone. At first, he denied everything, insisting he had nothing to do with her death. But evidence told a different story, And then came the second blow. A child, someone who should have been worrying about homework, about friendships, about the small dramas of teenage life, not plotting violence against a woman whose only crime was trusting the wrong people. The realization was staggering. A 14-year-old, complicit in a deadly ambush. Detectives couldn't wrap their heads around it. What could drive someone so young into a scheme like this? Was it manipulation? Fear? Or was it something darker? The case cracked open further with the mention of another figure, a shadow looming behind the teenagers. A man in his 40s, with a past steeped in crime. He was the puppeteer, the one who allegedly pulled the strings while letting the youngest hands do the dirtiest work. With him in the mix, the crime stopped looking like a chaotic robbery and began to resemble something orchestrated, deliberate, and merciless. Step by step, police pieced together the timeline. Rhea was lured into meeting, promised a connection that turned into a setup. She arrived with her Camaro, unaware of what was waiting. In the confrontation that followed, she refused to surrender her car. That refusal, her final act of defiance, cost her life. The arrests came swiftly, but they brought little comfort. Watching teenagers in handcuffs, faces pale under the harsh lights of the interrogation room, was a sight that left detectives shaken. It raised questions no one wanted to answer. What does it say about a society where children are drawn into violence this grave? How does someone so young cross a line they can never uncross? When news broke of the arrests, the community's grief deepened into disbelief. Candlelight vigils burned brighter, voices cracked with sorrow, and questions filled the air. People mourned not only Rhea, but also the innocence lost in those who had taken her life. Yet even as suspects sat behind bars, justice felt far away. For Rhea's family, the nightmare wasn't over. Trials lay ahead, testimony that would force them to relive the night she died. And still, the biggest question lingered. Was Rhea killed only for her car, or was she targeted because of who she was? The line between robbery and hate crime blurred in the shadows of the case, and prosecutors struggled to pin down motive. But for her loved ones, the motive hardly mattered. Their daughter, their sister, their friend was gone. And in the end, they were left asking what so many ask after tragedies like this. Could it have been prevented? If someone had reached that 14-year-old sooner, if someone had offered another path, would Rhea still be alive? Or was her fate sealed the moment she stepped into her Camaro that night? In Part 1, we step into the courtroom where the truth about what happened to Rhea is revealed through chilling testimony, and where a grieving family confronts the men accused of taking her life. The results will shock you, and what happens next will raise even deeper questions. If you've been following Rhea's story, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Courtrooms are strange places. They are where silence and words collide, where grief has to take the shape of testimony, where anger has to sit in neat rows of benches, and where lives hang in the balance of 12 strangers' judgment. For Rhea Milton's family, walking into that courtroom was like stepping into another nightmare. On one side sat Rhea's mother, her siblings, her nieces and nephews. Their faces carried exhaustion, the kind that comes from nights spent crying until sleep no longer comes. On the other side, just feet away, were the accused, an 18-year-old boy who should have been starting his adult life, a 14-year-old girl whose presence in shackles broke hearts as much as it stirred fury, and whispers of an older man said to be the one who manipulated them all. The proximity was almost unbearable. Prosecutors wasted no time painting the picture. They described how Raya was lured out that night, how her Camaro became the bait in a robbery that spiraled into murder. Jurors listened as messages were read aloud, digital evidence that revealed a plot disguised as casual conversation. Each text, each timestamp, carried the weight of inevitability, but what cut deepest were the details of Raya's final moments. The prosecutor's voice grew heavier as they described how she resisted, how she fought not to give up her car, how she pounded on doors in the dark hallway of life's last trial, begging for help that never came. The words left the room heavy, and even jurors struggled to look up from their notes. The defense had little to work with. For the 18-year-old, attorneys argued he hadn't intended for anyone to die, that the plan was for a robbery, nothing more. He was young, they reminded the jury, impulsive, easily swayed. As for the 14-year-old girl, her attorneys leaned into her age. How could someone so young fully comprehend the consequences? Was she a mastermind, or was she another victim, caught in the gravity of an older man's manipulation? But intent or not, the result was the same. A young woman was dead, a family was shattered, and a community was left grieving. Ria's mother took the stand, her voice trembling as she described the daughter she had raised, the woman she had loved. She painted a picture of Raya's kindness, of her perseverance in the face of struggles, of her dreams that now would never come true. She spoke directly to the jury, asking them to see her daughter as more than a statistic, more than just a case number on their docket. Her siblings followed, each one carrying a piece of Raya's story. They talked about her laughter, about how she made people feel safe, about the way she took care of her patients with tenderness that could never be replaced. There were tears in the courtroom, even from strangers. The defendants sat silently, their eyes lowered, their futures shrinking with every word spoken. At moments, the weight of their youth was impossible to ignore, but for the family, sympathy was not enough to bridge the chasm of what had been taken. The trial moved forward like a storm. Evidence mounted. Witnesses filled in the gaps. Surveillance footage was shown, timelines laid out, and the story became clearer with each passing day. When the jury finally disappeared into deliberations, the tension in the courtroom was thick enough to choke on. Hours passed. Then, the word everyone had been waiting for: verdict. The jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. The silence as the four-person stood was unbearable. And then, the words broke through. Guilty. The 18-year-old was convicted, sentenced to life behind bars. The 14-year-old, too young for life without parole, faced years in juvenile custody before a decision about her adult sentencing would be made. The older man, the alleged puppeteer, remained in the shadows of the justice system, his involvement less clear, his fate delayed. For Raya's family, the guilty verdict was both relief and torment. Yes, there was accountability. Yes, the system had recognized their daughter's worth. But no sentence could bring her back. No verdict could erase the sound of silence in that hallway. The unanswered knocks. The cries that never reached their ears. As the courtroom emptied, one thought lingered above all others. Justice had been served, but had anything truly changed? Raya was gone. The young defendants' lives were effectively over, and an entire community was left haunted by the reality of what hate, greed, and silence can do when combined. And so the question lingered, pressing down on everyone who followed the case. When children become killers, when innocence is lost on both sides of tragedy, what does justice really look like? In Part 2, we'll go beyond the courtroom to vigils, community reactions, and the painful recognition that Raya's story is just one part of a much larger pattern of violence against Black trans women. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because what follows will expose an even harder truth to face. When the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, it didn't mean the story was over. For Rhea Milton's family, the real story had just begun, the story of living without her, of waking up every day to an absence that no court ruling could fill. In the days after her death, the community came together in ways both heartbreaking and beautiful. Vigils sprang up in Liberty Township and across Ohio, candles flickering against the night sky, illuminating signs with Raya's name written in bold letters. Friends and strangers alike gathered, their voices soft at first, then rising in unison with prayers, with songs, with chants for justice. The glow of those candles was fragile, but it was also defiant, a light against the darkness that had tried to erase her. Her family stood at the center of those gatherings, holding photos of Rhea, their voices cracking as they shared stories about the woman she was. They spoke of her laughter, of her dreams, of her determination to live authentically. Each story pulled her out of the shadows of victimhood and placed her back in the light of humanity, where she belonged. But the vigils weren't just about Rhea. They were also about something bigger. Each candle lit that night represented not just her, but all the transgender women who had lost their lives under similar circumstances. For years, the statistics had been climbing, each year setting grim new records for violence against transgender people, especially Black trans women. The names piled up, often forgotten by the wider public but never by those in the LGBTQ community. Each one was a reminder that Raya's story wasn't isolated. It was part of a devastating pattern, a cycle of violence fueled by prejudice, by silence, by systems that failed to protect the most vulnerable. Activists spoke at Raya's vigils, reminding the crowd that justice for her could not end with a guilty verdict. Justice had to mean change. Change in how law enforcement treated cases involving trans women. Change in how the media reported them. Change in how society at large viewed people whose only crime was daring to live as themselves. The grief was heavy, but within it burned determination. People carried signs that read, "Say her name," and "Justice for Raya." Hashtags spread her story online, ensuring that she would not be buried in silence. Her death became both a wound and a rallying cry, urging people to look closer at the reality facing Black transgender women every day. For her family, the aftermath was quieter but no less devastating. Birthdays passed without her. Holidays carried an empty chair at the table. Her mother sometimes scrolled through old messages, her eyes filling with tears at words that now felt like treasures. "Love you, Mom." The absence was sharpest in the everyday moments, the sudden urge to call her, the memory of her laughter echoing in a quiet room, the realization that her dreams would never have a chance to grow. And yet, even in grief, there was a sense of legacy. Rhea's life, though cut short, continued to touch people. Stories of her kindness, her resilience, and her authenticity inspired others to keep living their truth. She became a symbol not of tragedy alone, but of courage. But that legacy also came with responsibility. For those who lit candles in her honor, for those who whispered her name in prayer, the question was clear. What now? What do we do with the weight of her story? Do we let it fade into memory, another case swallowed by time, or do we let it change us, force us to confront the ways in which society allows violence to thrive? Because Raya's death wasn't just about one night, one robbery gone wrong. One group of people making choices they could never take back. It was about all the moments before, the systems that failed to see her, the prejudices that made her more vulnerable, the silence that greeted her cries for help, and that silence still lingers. At the end of each vigil, as candles burned low and people drifted away, the question hung in the air like smoke. How many more names will we have to say before something truly changes? The courthouse had emptied. The cameras were gone. Reporters closed their notebooks and drove away. But the silence that followed the trial was louder than anything. For Ashley's family, for her friends, and for the community who had marched with candles in their hands, silence was not peace. It was absence. It was the echo of footsteps that would never return, the laughter that would never fill a room again. At her family's home, the air still carried her presence. Her mother would glance at the doorway, half expecting to see Ashley breezing in with that same playful smile and arms full of shopping bags or hairstyling tools. The emptiness in those small, daily moments is what grief really is. Not the public speeches, not the headlines, but the invisible weight left behind. Yet out of this silence, voices began to rise. Vigils were held across Atlanta. Candles flickered in the night air, painting a sea of light that reached far beyond the street where she died. Friends stood trembling in the cold, speaking her name, recounting how she had lifted others up even when she was hurting. Some read poems, some said prayers, and some just cried, because words were not enough. But beyond the tears and flowers, there was also anger. Anger at a world where violence against transgender women, especially Black transgender women, had become so common, it risked being treated as ordinary. In truth, Ashley's case was not just about one life lost. It was a reflection of a much larger crisis, one that activists had been shouting about for years, one that too many people had chosen not to hear. Statistics alone could chill the blood. Year after year, dozens of trans women in the United States, most of them women of color, were killed, often in brutal ways. And too often their stories ended in silence, without justice, without a name in the news. Ashley's murder, and the trial that followed, broke that silence in Atlanta. It forced people to look, to listen, to acknowledge. For her family, though, numbers meant nothing. This wasn't a statistic. This was their daughter, their sister, their friend. At her memorial, one relative stood trembling before the crowd and said, "Ashley was love. She didn't just live in this world, she gave pieces of herself to everyone she touched, and now it's on us to make sure her name lives on." And it has. Local organizations began invoking Ashley's story in workshops, school events, and community meetings. Her face appeared on posters calling for justice. Her name echoed in city council meetings when funding for LGBTQ safety programs was debated. In a way, Ashley became both a wound and a banner, a loss too heavy to carry, and a reason to fight harder for change. But here's the haunting truth. For every Ashley, there are so many others whose names we don't hear, whose cases never make the news, whose killers walk free. That reality forces us to confront a question. What does it take for society to finally pay attention? Must a family's grief be broadcast on the evening news before people care? Must another woman fall in a silent hallway before we decide that enough is enough? Ashley's silence that night was not just her own. It was the silence of locked doors, neighbors who didn't hear, and a world too comfortable in looking away. But her courage, in living as herself despite every risk, is the part of the story that should never be forgotten. She walked into rooms with pride. She styled hair with love. She cared for others without apology. That kind of courage is louder than any silence, and so the story ends where it began, in that hallway. But this time, we do not see Ashley alone. We see the echoes of her life, the people she touched, the movements that carry her name. The silence remains, yes, but it is no longer empty. It is filled with our responsibility, all of ours, to ensure that Ashley's story is not just a headline, but a call. Because the real question is not what happened to Ashley. We know that answer, and it hurts. The real question is, what will we do with the silence she left behind? There's a lot more to reflect on. Stories like Ashley's that reveal truths about our world we'd rather not face. And if you want to walk with me through them to hear the stories that demand we look closer, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.